Thank you very much.
Yes.
So yes, I'll be taking a slightly different approach to Chris, who was talking about the mediumship aspects, which we might refer to as sought experiences, something people might go looking for to attend a one-to-one sitting or seance originally, and the studies that have followed since then. We're looking here at direct after-death communication, so spontaneous phenomena that may relate to survival, the idea of the mind, personality surviving beyond death. I'll probably skip over the department name. Chris has already mentioned a few things about Northampton, but this is our research group, EECS. I did hear him mention that, and that's the noise that you make in a haunted location when something scary happens. But this is the campus. This is Waterside Campus. This is where we are based, and psychology is based. And we have a department, that research group, EECS, that you could argue to be possibly the biggest active research group for parapsychology, transpersonal psychology, consciousness studies, cognitive psychology and neuroscience combined. Staff with an interest in all of those, from full-time members of staff, part-time and research degree students, about 15 of us or so spread out within that group of interests. I could just briefly mention some of the things that we've got going on in terms of research projects and what the PhD students are doing. To leave the survival stuff to last, we have a flotation tank project at the moment, for example. We already did a pilot study of that, myself and David Saunders and Glenn Hitchman, working with commercial centres. Another variation of the Gansfeld, which I don't remember if Chris mentioned that specifically, no, but a relaxation technique that's been used time and time again since the 1970s in parapsychology to try and induce experiences in the lab to look at things like telepathy or remote viewing, whereby someone would be in a big reclining chair. They listen to a hypnotic induction and relax their arms and legs, and they have eye shields on, looking up at a red light through the eye shield, so you get this nice pink haze, and you just say out loud all these feelings and visions that you may have. In the flotation tank, you get that sense instantaneously from the flotation that you get from the salt water. Feeling like you're in a giant womb and being reborn, an instant out-of-body experience type feeling because of the flotation. So Kirsty Allen is our PhD student taking that pilot study forward to look at, is it a good method within parapsychology to use flotation tanks and its other benefits as well. We have Mike Dorr looking at dietary practice and psi phenomena, so fasting, vegetarianism, veganism, and what religions have done that practice these, how they've reported anomalous experiences, spiritual experiences. But what about putting that to the test? If vegans and vegetarians and other dietary practices are subjected to an ESP test, how well do they score? So this has gone from interviewing known psychics and their dietary practices to a survey of people that don't make these claims that they have psychic abilities, through to lab tests as well. We have a couple of projects that have come and gone, one nearing the end on near-death experiences within the scope of a PhD. And then we also have projects on mediumship, two that go hand in hand. Ewan and Phil are working on those, looking at sitter perspectives and medium perspectives of their experiences, and also some on after-death communications, which we're talking about here. Rachel is looking at them in elderly populations, and Erin is looking at them through lockdown scenarios of COVID-19. So during that period of lockdown, were people that were isolated and lost a family member in the hospital, they were taken away, slight cough, and 2 weeks later they were gone. They had no idea they were going to pass away. Did they have experiences about their home? Or elderly relatives in care homes that they weren't allowed to visit and say goodbye to. Without that ability to say goodbye during that time of loss, did they have a sense of presence? Did they dream about them? Did they smell perfumes or tobaccos associated with that person? And they had no idea that that person had passed away, and perhaps they found out afterwards. Are those periods of lockdown and isolation comparable to other periods of time? Say the Second World War and the blackouts and being told to stay inside, shut the doors and windows and black out everything, and everyone's in there, and they also have relatives off fighting in the war that they don't know have necessarily passed away. Do they have an experience in the homestead? So Erin's looking at that sequence of periods throughout time and this more recent period with COVID. Chris has mentioned so much research, but just to go over this very briefly, parapsychology, you probably all, because of what you're doing here, your interest here in this group, you're familiar with it, but let's just go over it. All these kinds of experiences are encapsulated under the term psi-type phenomena. Parapsychology is the scientific study of experiences which, if they are as they seem to be, are in principle outside of the realm of human capabilities as presently conceived by conventional scientists. So presently, in terms of, we don't really know the known mechanisms, but we're certainly aware of the phenomena, people are reporting it, and we're trying to understand it through the lab studies that we're doing as well. And science is always shifting. Every area of science is asking new questions and trying to chart new territory and make a step forward. Parapsychology could be seen as a branch of psychology that is looking at some of these experiences that just don't seem to fit the bill. But we had a long chat just before now upstairs talking about how you can bring in physics and anthropology and sociology and many other disciplines to contribute to why do people have these experiences, what are the cultural differences, what might be going on here, what are the conventional explanations, how can we separate those from anything else going on. And certainly those lab studies, especially for example, the mediumship study that Chris mentioned with Roy and Robertson, all those sitters and people being singled out to have a reading, there's one example of trying to work it so nothing else could potentially seep through. That reading is definitely meant for this one person. So, parapsychology breaks down into 3 different areas of exploration, ESP, extrasensory perception. This term was coined by Joseph Banks Ryan at Duke University in the 1920s. Extrasensory perception was the title of his first monograph that was extremely popular. They weren't sure what kind of reception that they would get. It was a small publication by the Boston Society for Psychic Research in 1934 when it came out. But then it was very quickly picked up and reviewed positively by the New York Times, who was very sympathetic, the science editor, to parapsychology, and then quickly got republished as a popular book that you can still get to this day. ESP breaks down into 3 different areas: clairvoyance, a seeing of information at distance; telepathy, a mind-to-mind interaction; and precognition, either a distinct vision of something that hasn't happened yet, or just an uncomfortable hunch. You just decide to change your mind for the last minute perhaps, and realise that whatever you were about to do, say take a car journey, there was a big car pile-up, an accident on that very route you would have taken. Perhaps you having that hunch and acting on it helped you avoid either danger and injury or even certain death as well. So we see many examples of this through dreams people might have had about 9/11 and various other incidents as well, where a lot of people have come forward saying they had these distinct visions before that event happened. There's a very interesting talk online about that actually called, I think it's ESP and Emotion by Dr. Richard Broughton, that he presented a few years after 9/11 at the Parapsychology Foundation, looking at some of the statistics of people that regularly went to the World Trade Centers and the various stories some people had about changing their mind that day about going in. So that's ESP. PK, psychokinesis, also commonly known as telekinesis, the ability to influence people or the environment via the power of the mind alone. If you believe in PK, raise my hand. Well done. You're not raising my hand though, you're raising your own. Need to raise mine. Terrible joke, and Chris is getting sick of it because he hears it all the time. We're just on repeat with this play. Most commonly, people will associate this with metal bending, spoon bending. Hands up, genuine. Your hands up if you are aware of Uri Geller. Uri Geller. Are you aware of Uri Geller? You are, most of you. Thank goodness. When I ask my classes now, I'm getting older, they're getting younger. None of them now know who Uri Geller is. When I started out, everyone will put their hands up like that, and steadily the hands are going down, unless I get a mature student in the class.
Is he still alive or
Oh yes, yeah, I speak to him about once a week. I send him messages back and forth. He's very happy in Israel. He's just, in the last year, opened up his own museum to himself. And outside he has the world's largest bent spoon. It came on the back of an articulate lorry, so it's this massive structure about the length of this room, a giant bent spoon that people go and take photos with. And so yeah, there's the Uri Geller Museum in Israel, and he's there ready to greet anyone that turns up, gives them a personal tour, and will bend a spoon for you while there. But Uri Geller is a whole different story we could go into about what's gone on there, what happened with the original studies, and later on. It's fascinating yet controversial with the fact that he had childhood experiences, became a professional magician, and then also claimed he could do this legitimately, aside from magic and misdirection. But another story. We'll come back another time and talk about that. So PK and then survival. So this would be anything that suggests survival of the mind or personality outside of the body or beyond bodily death. So out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, and then through to, say, deathbed visions, apparitions, mediumship, reincarnation, electronic voice phenomena, so the spontaneous recordings, audio recordings of scratches, raps, taps, voices. And there could be other things as well. Instrumental transcommunication as another visions through television screens and other things. So that's what parapsychology will broadly be interested in, and so the after-death communications perfectly sit within survival. Chris mentioned the Fox sisters, and that really sparked off interest from various academics that spiritualism and reports of these experiences has gone on for centuries. But it was from that point and many other people coming forward claiming mediumship that by the end of that century you had Cambridge scholars, Trinity College, University Cambridge, that got together and from various disciplines of philosophy, psychology, physics, that wanted to know what's going on here. Have we already got the answers for these unusual experiences, hauntings and mediumship, or is this something new to learn? So they formed the Society for Psychical Research in 1882, which is still going strong to this day, and their first major publication was gathering up all of these reports that people might submit to them, and they produced this book, this 2-volume piece, Phantasms of the Living. So there are accounts in there, many accounts of people seeing apparitions of known living individuals as well as instances of phantasms of the dead. But it was a brilliant first survey that really sparked off everything, and I suppose is one of the main foundations of original after-death communication research. Because they collected so many cases, they could keep revisiting this sample of letters, of experiences people have had, and then do new analyses on them. So this one appeared in volume 5, called On Apparitions Occurring Soon After Death. That is Frederick Myers over there, one of the founders, and Edmund Gurney. So I believe it was Gurney that began writing this particular publication, passed away during the writing of it a month. Sorry, it's because I'm under the light. And Myers finished this paper off. So they took 231 cases of hallucinations of the dead from Phantasms of the Living, and 28 of those cases occurred within 1 week of the death of the individual visualised. In 104 cases, it was not known whether the recipient's cases preceded or followed the experience of death. This again is because it was early postal correspondence, someone is just submitting a letter to them, and so it's not like an interview where you could consistently ask the same questions. There's going to be missing information where the person didn't know to make that very clear, one bit of information or the other. So you would like all that information to be consistent, but they're just telling their story, so it's not known in some of those cases. In 40 cases, the experience of apparitions occurred within a 24-hour period, which you may be familiar with this. This is known as the crisis period, in which in the 12 hours leading up to death, at the point of death and 12 hours afterwards, many people may have experiences, unusual ones, related to, again, sense of presence phenomena, smells, touch, sounds, seeing of apparitions, dreams, poltergeist type phenomena, and yet they don't know a close friend or relative has necessarily passed away. They find out afterwards, but it's in this period of distress. The person might be in a lot of pain, or it's a sudden accident, and it's seemingly some way of letting this individual know that they're in this crisis. And so from their analysis, they did this pencil sketch drawing, just an example that they found that within 1 week, there could be even deathbed visions there, so someone is on their deathbed. Within that week, there's an steady increase of people having experiences. At the very moment of death, there's an absolute peak, so from the crisis to perhaps on the deathbed, again, the friends or family around the deathbed may see things, feel things. It's still a tradition in care homes and some hospices to keep the window open. When someone is dying, they're on their deathbed, nurses may keep this tradition as well, because a lot of people may report a rush of wind or something at the point that someone has taken their last breath. And this idea that, well, if something is leaving the body, spirit, consciousness, whatever it may be, it has a chance to leave and go out into this world. And then, within that year period afterwards, people might report some more of those similar experiences. Some people only report one, some people report multiple experiences. The next major survey that they did, that appeared in volume 10 of the proceedings, was called the Report on the Census of Hallucinations. Their main question that they sent out within the survey, and that's a survey of the 1890s, and it's amazing, postal correspondence at that time you'll see the figures in a moment. Their main question was, have you ever had a vivid impression of seeing or being touched or of hearing voices, which impression, so far as you could discover, was not due to any external cause? From the analysis of over 17,000 return questionnaires, that's impressive at the time, 10% reported types of hallucinations which could be considered a post-death encounter. So again, sense-of-present phenomena all the way through to apparitional experiences as well. So they were realising even at that time from surveying the population, those experiences, aside from other psychic experiences people reported in that census, is very common within that sample for people to report ADCs. My own interest in this area changed over time. I had a personal interest in haunting type phenomena. I go out and do investigations over time, sometimes with interested police officers as well. Pleasyvale Mill complex was one place where they thought they were having repeated break-ins, and yet everything was all locked up, and it seems things had been moved on the inside while the building was locked. But when I became an undergraduate student doing psychology and going to Northampton with a specific interest in parapsychology, I was reading a lot of books by D. Scott Rogo and Raymond Bayless. They had particular interest in survival of death, and one book that they co-authored, in fact it's probably the only piece they ever co-authored together, was this book, Phone Calls from the Dead, which was a 2-year investigation and analysis of 50 accounts of people allegedly having unusual telephone calls, not just from the dead, but other strange ones as well. But there was a large focus on deceased individuals. Another type of after-death communication as well. So much like that crisis example, you could have a ring, a telephone call from your friend Mary. She starts talking about a few things, familiar things, but it seems like a conversation like any other. It could be about half an hour or so in length. Phone goes down, ding dong, the doorbell rings, and you go and answer the door, and your friend Sam is there and looking quite upset. What's wrong? I've just come to tell you, didn't you know Mary died in a car accident yesterday? I just thought I should come and tell you. And yet you've just been speaking to Mary for half an hour on the telephone. You check with the call company, and seemingly there is no record of that call taking place. But all your other calls, to people or from people, are listed. So what has happened there? I updated this with a further analysis of 50 calls, and had a look at some other historical items as well that they'd not found, where people were trying to make telephone machines in the 1920s to contact the dead. People like Thomas Edison is one particular individual there, who gets mentioned in this very next clip. So I've got a clip for you here that is an example of one of those cases.
Well, I first heard about these cases when I first entered the field, which was close to 10, 12 years ago. And I really didn't take them seriously at all. I thought they were very outlandish. It was hard for me to believe that people were actually getting phone calls from people who were dead. But as the years progressed and I did more and more investigations, I discovered that these calls were fairly common. And then I realized that there was a major effect here that someone really had to study.
Mary Meredith of Oklahoma City recreates the night she purportedly received a phone call from the dead.
Of course, I don't tell everybody about it, because a lot of people still think that I'm crazy when they even hear about it. But I know that it was, and it happened to me.
Mary Meredith's case occurred in 1977. She had just been in the hospital. She had returned to her home not knowing that there was a letter waiting for her telling her that her cousin had died. She had been very close to this cousin. It was very soon after she read this letter from her mother that the phone rang, and it was from her cousin.
It just really upset me when I got the phone call, and I hung up on the first phone call because it upset me. But when she called back again, I said, I cannot believe that anyone would call someone and tell them that it's their cousin when my cousin is dead. I can't believe this. I said, and I have been sick, and I can't believe anyone would pull something on me like this. She said, but I know you've been sick. I was at the hospital with you. And I said, what are you talking about? And the phone started getting crackling, and then I couldn't hear her. It just faded away.
The idea that the dead can contact the living through electromagnetic devices is certainly not new with my research. Thomas Edison, for instance, several years before his death, became very fascinated with the idea that he could invent a machine that could bring through the voices of the dead. And even apparently made some sketches of such equipment. Edison, as is well known, was extremely paranoid about his ideas and kept them very, very hidden, so he never patented his ideas. But certain sketches did surface after that purported to be the machine he was working on.
So when did the research get recognised? We've got all of these studies that are being done by the Society for Psychical Research, but why wasn't science paying more interest and attention to them? That they have a very clear overlap with the study of death, thanatology, and also counselling for bereavement. So why wasn't there more awareness? Why didn't we hear about it more? Even with people like Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. She created a lot of awareness for death, dying and bereavement research by the late 1960s with her book in 1969 on death and dying. She did many publications after that. She did many world tours talking about her research. But still, by the 1950s, you'd be lucky to find any book that's a study of death and it mentioned anything such as sense of presence phenomena, sometimes a couple of sentences. If that, not whole studies by the SPR. They're just suppressed and not really there. However, there was a researcher, as such, he was a general practitioner in North Wales called William Dewi Rees, Dewi being the Welsh equivalent of David, known as Dewi most of the time. And he was doing a lot of research. General practitioners don't do research. They're your local doctor to go and see. They write you your prescription and away you go. But he wasn't comfortable with just doing that. And he'd been a general practitioner in a few places. But while he was there, he was doing research papers and submitting them to Omega, also the Journal of Thanatology, the British Medical Journal, things like rural tractor fatalities and the incidents of those occurring and various other things, all surrounding death and loss. But then he started to move more towards research groups. He would go along to conferences and he wanted this recognition of being a genuine researcher. So he went back to university, he went to King's College London, decided to take on an MD thesis by research. He couldn't get it done under the banner of medical science, but psychiatry was willing to take on this research. He basically initially wanted to look at negative responses to bereavement. What are the negative reactions to bereavement, such as not wanting to socialise with people, oversensitiveness to noise, sleeplessness, loss of appetite, and many other things. You could list many things that could come as a consequence of separation anxiety and loss. So he went out and started to interview people, also people that were members of that general practice as well, patients, and he interviewed 293 widows and widowers about their experiences of loss. By the end, though, a few people started to say, oh yes, after they died, I felt their presence around me still. He hadn't really had this mentioned by most of the population that he looked at, so he went back to these people and re-interviewed them, specifically asking them, did you have an experience like that? Did you feel your partner around you after they died, or some other experience? To which he found people were saying yes, and just over 50% of them were reporting these types of experiences. Everything from a sense of presence all the way through to apparitions. And so, most common within the first 10 years, but we've talked about previously the SPR discovering that crisis period within the first 24 hours as well, but still finding that beyond that year point, up to 10 years, people were still reporting them. Most importantly, gender, social groups, age, level of depression, etc. It didn't really play a factor in the occurrence of the hallucinations. It seems if you were just going to have one, you were going to have one. Now, why was this important in creating a shift? He also found that most people found these experiences to be helpful. Initially scary for some because seeing the apparition of a loved one in the corner might have taken some people by surprise. They might have even seen them looking like the way in which they died, some sort of injury or a health decline and looking very withdrawn, but that rarely ever happens. Some people report people looking younger and vibrant, sometimes looking younger than the point at which you first knew them as well. But most people found them to be helpful. If they found them to be negative, sometimes reflecting on it over time, they will find that actually they turned it into something good, something positive. Once the thesis was completed in 1971, he immediately wrote up the findings, a summary of them for the British Medical Journal, which got published. It's one of the most popular cited papers for after-death communication, citing this British Medical Journal paper. And I'll come back to that in terms of us going back to that, looking at it with our own research and wanting to update things. But that created the shift. So when parapsychology or other areas of research started to mention after-death communications, they would cite this paper by Rees, 1971, British Medical Journal. And he had acknowledged the SPR in his thesis and in this research as well, and that was really important that it was getting into medical science. Following on from that, Julian Burton was the next person to take on PhD research into this area. For some reason, when I was doing my own PhD research, even though there were various papers out there and I'd acknowledged the early SPR stuff and then later stuff, even in nursing journals, I wanted to follow this trail of people that had done doctoral research, and at the time found that around 14 doctorates or so had been done in this area. It's probably now closer to 20 in total worldwide. But Julian Burton was the next person to do this, and he wrote a summary of his thesis, which was completed in 1980. He did a summary in Fate magazine in April 1982. One of his comments from looking at all these experiences people had and their reactions to it: "I'm afraid a bias still exists which considers it unacceptable to deal at face value with experiences such as seeing ghosts. The patient is trained to deny the experience or to explain it away as holding on to the loved one." So even there are a lot of stigma from going to see their local doctor about these experiences, something out the corner of your eye. I think some things were moving about, items that belong to the deceased, seeing them, smelling them, and the doctor is just saying, ignore those experiences, they're not important, they're not healthy, you're holding on, you need to move forward. When actually, Rees before that was showing that these are helpful experiences. Embrace the experience, it's helping you move forward. We'll come back to that. But why did he even get involved? His background was in theatre studies. That was his Bachelor of Arts degree. He'd been an actor for a considerable amount of time. His most famous film that he was in was called A Bucket of Blood. Has anyone seen that? Oh, I haven't either. Maybe I should sometime, I should find it. But he had an experience which prompted him to go back to higher education and explore these kinds of experiences. So his sample size there, as you saw before, was 206. He'd gone to various colleges and gone to psychology departments. I think initially he went to some of the religious study departments and then changed his mind, thought it might be a biased sample because of accepting of spiritual experiences through religious scripture. So he moved to the psychology departments and gave surveys to staff and students to look at their experiences. He also found the age range was quite vast, from 16 to people in their 80s, even close to 90s, would report these experiences. So even though he's gone to staff and students, people will be reflecting on people in their family, let's say, and how old they were and those demographics. This is his personal experience, and it's regarding his mother, who passed away in April 1973. I had always felt a strong bond between us, but by September, most of us in the family had returned to our routines, reconciled to her death. One evening that September, my wife and I were entertaining relatives. I was in the kitchen cutting a pineapple when I heard what I thought were my wife's footsteps behind me to the right. I turned to ask the whereabouts of a bowl, but realised she had crossed to the left outside of my field of vision. I turned in that direction to repeat my question and saw my mother standing there. Burton described his mother's apparition as looking 10 years younger than she was when she died, and in good health. She was wearing a detailed pale blue gown, which he had never seen before. He continues, "Ma!" I exclaimed. She smiled and then dissolved. She didn't disappear, she dissolved. I let out a great sigh and felt as if a heavy weight had been lifted from me, a weight I had not even felt until then. The next day, Burton contacted his sister to tell her of the experience, and she was very distraught. Not because of him saying he'd seen a ghost of their mother, that wasn't the disturbing thing, but she wanted the experience. Why you and not me? I spent more time with mother, why did she come to you? He goes on to explain that experience and mentions the detailed pale blue gown that he'd never seen before. Okay, that's the message from mother to me. I see now why she's come to you, you've got this distinct vision, but that element is for me. Why? And she goes on to explain that they did regular shopping trips, they went to look for clothes together, and it was several weeks before she died. They went somewhere, and she tried on this detailed pale blue gown, and she thought, oh, this is nice, let's have a look at the price there. $500? Oh, that's a lot of money. Should I treat myself? Shouldn't I? She ended up leaving it in the end. She didn't buy it, but she was so tempted. And her daughter remembers this whole conflict of, should I treat myself? Shouldn't I? Do you spend that amount of money on a gown? And so, in this kind of afterlife experience, she's wearing the gown that she liked that was so beautiful and very expensive. Afterlife shoplifting. But still, she's wearing it, and that was the message for her. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, in her book on death and dying in 1969, there was a whole chapter that's just listed as hope. But no one defined it. They didn't say, what is hope? And in this case, saying you've seen an apparition and then it gave you hope, what do you mean by that? And so we defined it, we went to positive psychology and explored that, and we looked at the various definitions throughout time, from the beginnings of it with Pandora's box, and her letting out all the evils of this world, war and tyranny and so forth, and slamming the lid shut, and deep within the recesses still there was hope. In times of disaster and great despair, and at your lowest ebb, there is still hope for moving forward, that if you've got that low, it can only get better after this point. So how is the experience helping in this sense? So we looked at 100 individuals, 50 who had never reported an after-death communication, and 50 who did. And we gave out various questionnaires on paranormal belief, afterlife belief, death anxiety. We used the Nowotny Hope Scale, which is here, that is exploring hope in times of disaster, and we just reworded the introduction to the questionnaire to incorporate after-death communications and personal loss. So, let's have a look at the scale here. So over here, on the experimental group side, these were the people that had experiences. And on the other side, the control group, these are bereaved individuals that didn't report after-death communications. On that side, they were higher in hope generally, and on this side not. But it was very varied. These are mixed individuals. This side is a group of people that are big believers and also not believers at all, and the same on the other side. Absolute skeptics through to absolute believers. But this is all involving bereavement. So on that side, they were higher hopers anyway, and then after loss and having their experience, they had dropped in levels of hope, but that is not a statistically significant drop. They have dropped, but not statistically significantly so. On this side, they did drop, and it was statistically significant. So we concluded from that we are measuring hope here. This is our first attempt at saying, look, it's present, and it's doing something. The experience might be, because it's not dropped all that much, it's acting as a buffer. It's giving at least an element of hope back that you've lost to say, there might be a continuation here. There might still be watching over you. People might even turn to the literature, look at this research, ask friends about their experiences, turn to authorities, the SPR and other places, and ask the people doing this research, what are these experiences like? All those elements, but especially their own personal experience, is giving that hope. It's facilitating that gap where they've lost hope and allowing bereavement to move on far quicker and healing and moving forward, hoping and coping, hoping and healing. I'll mention, because I mentioned Snyder's book that was there, hope works in two processes. It's the same thing. If you have a cognitive agency, you've thought of something that you want, and then you have a thought pathway, how do I get to it? And when you work your way through that, even if it breaks down, you reroute yourself and you get to what you want. And it can be a very small interest that you want to a very big interest. If you've got the will, you will find the way. Willpower and way power. And so that experience is giving more access to the idea that, well, I live a good life, I continue moving on, I think of that person, these experiences will come from time to time and they will buffer me. And I don't need to worry about them because they're still around perhaps. And maybe when I die, I will be reunited, and so there's less need to worry about death because these experiences are buffering that. So that's where hope is creeping in. Were you expecting something to happen? A very small amount of people said yes, the vast majority said no, so that really shows their true spontaneity and that most people are saying, no, I wasn't expecting something to happen. We asked the same question as Derry Rees, were these helpful, harmful, unsure? Most people found these to be helpful, just one individual found it scary. But again, on revisiting their experiences over time, that they did incorporate it into their worldviews and how they thought about life and death, but we wanted to know about that instant reaction. This graph is kind of similar to Myers and Gurney in that peak and then drifting off over a year, but this sample is a lot smaller. This is just 50 individuals. So within a day, that 24-hour period, there's a peak, and then stuff happening within a year's period, but then we have beyond a year as well. That signifies, from what I remember, someone had an experience 2 years afterwards, 30 years afterwards, and 32 years afterwards within our sample. So they continued for a long time. And so they're well beyond the point of what we call being bereft, being in grief. So you can't overly argue that it's because of grief that you've had the experience. It was truly spontaneous, 30 years down the line, and something just happened. Where did it happen? A lot of people at home. That makes sense in terms of conventional explanations. There are photographs, there are personal items, there are smells, there are memories in each room. Perhaps they even dip their head round the door now and then to say to you, would you like a cup of coffee? I'll get you one. They're not doing that anymore because they've gone, but there's that expectancy, that anticipation that perhaps they might still be there. So that might be why in the homestead so many things happen. But look, out driving, on a walk, in the cemetery, engaged with the TV or a laptop, or away from home, staying in a hotel perhaps, or with friends and relatives. People had experiences all over the place, not just in the home. Sense of presence phenomena was the most popular, but then voices and sounds, apparitions, dreams, psychokinetic phenomena, and then various other things, symbolic experiences, seeing a robin redbreast, a feather fall from the ceiling randomly in your home, a coin drops on the floor, things like that. Sometimes when people saw butterflies, they were the only one that could see it. It landed on their hand or nearby, but still they felt it was to do with this person who had passed away. So how are these experiences positive? Well, Stanley Krippner made a very nice comment in this book, The Survival of Human Consciousness, which is an anthology by Lance Storm and Michael Thalbaum. He looked at all the research that had been done at the time to 2006. He said, often the experient has a severe debilitating mood of depression or grief dissolved as a consequence of a change of outlook due to the experience. And the experient comes to believe that the deceased is not suffering in any way and is happy. In other cases, relationship issues are resolved or unfinished business is concluded, allowing people to have this final goodbye or a hug or whatever it may be. Chris mentioned the mediumship, which we would call the SALT experience. There are therapies involved where you can induce an after-death communication to allow people to have this final goodbye or an apology or whatever it may be. Psychomantium is one. A dimly lit room full of mirrors in which eventually if they think about the individual they've lost, they start to come forward as hallucinations. Another is EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, and it's a hypnotic technique. It's also been used on military personnel where a civilian died that they thought they could have saved, anything from a child to an adult or a colleague has got shot and they thought they could have intervened and saved them, but they didn't at the last minute, and they feel this absolute grief that, was I responsible? Could I have done something different? And I think it's Alan Botkin who wrote the book Induced After-Death Communications and talks about this therapy approach where these military personnel will sit there, go through it, and they feel that their after-death communication induced in therapy is so strong they can reach out and touch that individual, hold them, hug them, and say their goodbyes and apologies, whatever it may be. But we're talking about it here again in this spontaneous sense. He says they're therapeutic in nature with useful applications, and therefore, until science develops the technology to confirm or falsify the survival hypothesis, it is up to the experienced to dismiss them as exceptional experiences that are just curious but unimportant anomalies, or to construct them into exceptional human experiences and revel in their transformative power, their healing capability. So what happened after that? After my PhD, Chris was at a conference and met Evelyn there in the middle, and she announced that she'd either just received or was about to apply for funding to look into after-death communications, which was her personal interest. And Chris mentioned the PhD research that we'd done and said, would you be interested in getting together and we form a little research group here to actually look into this. We've got the benefits of the university. Evelyn had got her background and interest in this. She'd written books on this. And so getting together would really help each other out. So we formed together with David Lorimer as well, who's the director of the Scientific and Medical Network. And we did a number of trips out to Geneva at a home to construct a new questionnaire to look at these experiences in initially English, French and Spanish languages. And we probably spent, when we more or less done the questionnaire, 2 or 3 days solid sat around her dining table going through question after question after question to make sure, is it saying and asking the right things to receive the right kind of feedback that we need? And every element, we asked about dreams, we asked about smells, we asked about touch, we asked about visions, everything you could think of. If you did the questionnaire in full, it took 40 to 45 minutes to fill in, and we worried, are people going to get bored with this? Are they just going to give up halfway through and say it's too long? Some colleagues were a bit sceptical as to whether it was too long a questionnaire. But you're giving someone a platform. How often does someone get to officially participate in a study like this to tell you about their experiences or speak to individuals that their primary job is to look into these experiences? And so everyone went in and completed this questionnaire from start to finish and shared sometimes some very lengthy experiences. It initially went out on Evelyn's website. There is another website I'll mention towards the end of this talk. But it went out there, it was live for 3 or 4 months or so in each of the languages, and initially we got just over 1,000 responses. So we'd gone well beyond Dewi Rees and that 293 widows and widowers interviewed, and got all of this survey data. We also have Sophie Morrison involved as well as a research assistant, because we had so much data that came from this. We really needed to spend the time to actually separate it all and look at what was going on. So it represents an attempt to map in more detail and with a much larger sample the phenomenology of after-death communications, their covariates and effects on the recipient, particularly in relation to recovery from loss of a loved one. So the survey comprised of 194 questions, presented intelligently, and they were also put on this online survey platform. I mentioned the languages there. So these are some of our demographics as well. More females than males took part, but that's also quite typical when we look at spontaneous experiences day to day, particularly geared towards the afterlife as well. Afterlife belief is much higher in females than it is in males, so more females are coming forward there. Nothing out of the ordinary. Mean age was 51, and the age range, just like Julian Burton, quite vast, 18 to 89 in this particular sample. So, fresh data, fresh cases, unlike the ones that I've just discussed before that have come from previous decades, these are what our modern experiences are like. I woke suddenly for no reason from a good sleep and saw my grandfather at the end of my bed. He seemed slightly younger, healthier, and radiating pure love. He smiled at me and said, "I'm going away, my wee dove," his pet name for me. I smiled back at him and looked at my alarm clock. It was 6 a.m. Then he was gone. It didn't occur to me to ask my grandmother where he was going, my grandfather where he was going or why he was in my room at 6 in the morning. I just slipped back into a peaceful sleep. I was later wakened by the telephone ringing and my grandmother sobbing on the phone that Papa was dead. His death certificate later stated that the approximate time of death was 6 a.m. So there's an example of a crisis case within that time period, and not knowing that he has passed away, and later getting that confirmation at the exact time of the experience. My mother was not anticipated to live more than a few days. I was in bed around midnight and suddenly sensed her presence at the side of my bed. She spoke my name and patted my shoulder. I felt Mum had passed. Within 10 minutes, my brother phoned to tell me that she had died a few moments before his call to me. So that was unknown information. These are multiple witnesses, so other people being there. In a library, the very real apparition of an uncle who died many years ago, he was also seen by a young man sitting next to me. 48 hours after my daughter's death, I was in my room with a friend in the late evening. We were discussing something else. Suddenly my daughter came and hugged us both at the same time. She put her hand on each of our backs. We were startled and exclaimed, "Marina." My deceased father-in-law, Henry, had been at a distance in the corner of the room. My sister-in-law felt cold and suddenly asked me what was wrong. The cat, asleep on my lap, then sprang up, arched its back and first standing up. Claws dug into my leg, staring at the corner of the room where Henry was. She would never go near that corner. Even if she was not fed for 2 days and you put her food down there, she was frightened to go near that area. So even animals getting involved. So in homage to Dewi Rees, when we did this, the initial paper that we put out there, the one that we wanted to be the first one, was one that Chris took the lead on, and that was to just look at the overall statistics of what was going on here and mention about these healing properties, this ability to help with the bereavement process that these experiences bring. So we looked at, going back to the British Medical Journal, the time that we were really putting this all together, it was the absolute height of COVID. So as you can imagine, most medical journals were really dealing with that and not much else. So we were being very tactful, and we looked at perhaps still sticking to psychiatry because that was the basis of his work, and we went to the British Journal of Psychiatry, Open, and we're really pleased with the peer-reviewed feedback. We had the typical things that we had to correct and work through, but the reviewers personally said as well within their feedback that, give us some examples of this, we'd like to hear more of this. We only had so many words to use, but it was great that they said, more please, so there's always an opportunity to go back. So it's open access, you can look at our initial paper that's in there, but there are so many other things that we need to do. Out of all the different things we asked, we can go back to crisis cases, which we're working on now, and messages received, we're writing those up, specifically those areas. But you can go down all these other routes and many more that we still need to analyse, that we keep joking that we've probably got 10 years worth of data here that we need to work on and start to get out into various journals that are relevant, from parapsychology to medical science and death, dying and bereavement journals. Here's another example of one of the papers we did that went in Explore. We also have one in Omega, Journal of Death and Dying. So we've steadily been churning these out. During that time as well, this opportunity came up. It was last year that the process took place. Everyone had to start writing, but Robert Bigelow, who's an aerospace entrepreneur, put out this essay award saying, I want the best evidence for life after death in an essay of no more than 25,000 words. You can single author it, you can do it as a group of people, but this is what I want. And initially, the top award was $500,000, and then second and third place of $300,000 and $150,000. People were asked to take part, or you applied to take part. So there was a whole kind of process of people submitting their qualifications and how they were relevant to writing this essay. I think you had to have spent at least 4 to 5 years or so doing psychical research or survival-based research, or showing some sort of why it's relevant that you write an essay. Went through all that process, and when it came to the deadline, I think they had a total of 206 essays that were good enough to go off to a judging panel. And so those down there are the judges' trophies that they got for taking part and sifting through all of these and deciding which was the best one. And we threw our hat into the ring. We had a go at this because we had this fresh data from this ADC project, but we had so much knowledge that we could draw on from the SPR, our own personal libraries. So we dedicated different writing duties. Evelyn had something to do, David had something to do, Chris had something to do, I did. And we looked at hauntings, mediumship, deathbed visions, reincarnation, the ADCs. We talked about the philosophical ideas behind survival, and we had a really neat introduction and ending as well. We thought we did a really good job, and so there was that anticipation of, are we going to get a big prize here? Are we going to get enough money to afford as another PhD student out of this if we split it up? They started to realise they got such good quality essays that they created more prizes. I think there was 11 runner-up prizes of $50,000. And so we're really waiting in anticipation of what we get. The email came through and we got a honourable mention, which we'd never heard of before. That wasn't in the list of things, but it was still an invite to go out to Las Vegas, be at the award ceremony, and there was still a prize involved for that. And so Chris and I went out there to collect the award. What you see there, Jeffrey Mitchell had won the top prize, and then we also have Pim van Lommel and Leah Rugby, who got the third place there as well, who is a fellow of the University of Northampton as well, but is now becoming more involved in this Bigelow Institute for Consciousness Studies. They've just announced the second phase, so he has all of these essays that are open access about the best evidence for survival. The next phase now is he's offering research grants for empirical studies, empirical tests of survival. So people are putting in their applications for that. You saw Evelyn's website. This is one that was created thanks to Evelyn's work as well, that specifically is a collection of all the stuff that we've been doing, either together or even independently. So when Chris goes out to give talks, when I do, and it gets recorded, they've gone up there. When we've done media-based things, or radio, podcasts, articles, papers, chapters, they're all being collected on this website, and more information about the ADC project that we're doing as well. So that's a summary of what we're doing, and you saw the Scott Rogo video eventually as well. Thank you very much for your time. Do follow me on Twitter if you use Twitter. My email's there. As Chris mentioned, I'll be about tomorrow as well if you have any questions that you want to leave till tomorrow. But I think we're going through into a question and answer in a moment as well. So thank you very much for your time.